Hi everyone, it's time for our first lesson in Rapier and Dagger. So I'm first going to go over some of the major differences between Broadsword and Rapier and Dagger. And this is an historical progression from broadswords. So what we call broadswords back in the time that they were used, so medieval times, they would have just been called swords. At that time, metallurgy was not what it was today. And so what you were really looking for was just a big, large, heavy weapon that you could swing around and you'd be just as likely to crush somebody's limbs as you are to cut them. Many blades were not able to hold an edge as well as they do now. But as metallurgy developed, the swords became a lot lighter. You could create a smaller sword that is easier to maneuver and swing around, that could hold a nice sharp edge. And so the fencing and the sword fighting became a lot more specific, a lot more detailed, and schools of fencing began to develop with systems of parries and attacks. Prior to that, there wasn't really any codified structure for fighting. The winner in a fight was generally determined by whoever was more athletic and stronger and whoever had the most practical experience in battle. So this right here is a nice approximation of what we would call a rapier. As you can see, the blade is a lot thinner than a broadsword, but it's still quite long. It has a nice point at the end, but it does have edges. And the guard here is a lot fancier as well. Now, the rapier has the same three parts of the blade that are, same four parts of the blade on a broadsword. So it's got the three that are visible. So it still has the fort down here on the end. It still has the midsection, and it still has the foible there at the tip. And of course, it has a tang that goes through the handle into the pommel. These pommels are screw-on pommels. So just like with the broadswords, first thing you want to do is pick up the weapon, shake it around. If you feel any kind of shaking inside it, then you want to tighten that pommel as well. Now, it's got another part of the blade, though, right here, in between the fort and the tang. This part right here is called the ricasso, and it is a flat part of the blade. There's no edge there, and that is actually the part of the blade that we are going to grip. So to hold a rapier, you take your index finger and your thumb, and you pinch the ricasso between those two fingers, and then you take the other three fingers and you just gently wrap them around the handle. So we would hold a rapier like this. You do not want to hold the rapier like a handgun. You don't want to squeeze it like this. You want to pinch that ricasso right there. Okay, now there's a couple other things going on here. First, we've got these rings on the sides of the ricasso. These are called the pedons. They're there to protect the fingers. And then some rapiers, these ones, have a ring out here as well that's also designed to protect the fingers and the knuckles. So when you're holding a rapier, the ring is always on the outside of the hand. So it's covering the back of the hand and the knuckles. You don't hold it on the inside, covering the palm and the fingertips. It's always on the outside. Okay, and so this rapier also has this knuckle bow right here to further protect the knuckles, and some rapiers can have very, very elaborate fancy guards. Now, when you've got a knuckle bow, then the sword is no longer symmetrical. You can see that this side is different from this side, and therefore this edge is always going to be the true edge of the blade, and this edge is always going to be the false edge of the blade, and this sword is specifically built to be held by a right-handed sword fighter. Now, we do have a couple of rapiers that are symmetrical, and so this one right here does not have a knuckle bow, and therefore this one could be wielded by a right-handed or a left-handed swordsman. Now, we actually only have three of these nice aluminum rapiers because they are very expensive. They're about $250 to $300 a piece, but we also have a whole bunch of these steel single swords right here. These are less than $45 a piece, so much less expensive here. I actually assembled these from competitive fencing parts, but they can be used especially for practicing Rapier and Dagger, and so we will be using these to practice. If you need to check out weapons from Skyline, this is what you'll be checking out, one of these single swords right here. Now, a couple important things. First off, this right here, this single sword is steel. This rapier is aluminum. Steel is much harder than aluminum, so you never, ever fight these two weapons against each other. The steel weapon, even though it's much smaller and more dainty looking, it will rip these aluminum weapons to shreds, and these aluminum weapons are much more expensive expensive. So the aluminum only ever goes up against aluminum, and the steel only ever goes up against steel. Now you might also notice that this type of weapon is nice and wide and flat compared to this weapon. This weapon right here is an épée blade. It's a practice competitive fencing épée blade. It's triangular. Okay, you can see the tip of the triangle right there. You can see the flat part of the triangle with a little bit of a gutter right there. It's also known as a musketeer blade, whereas this blade, which is nice and flat and wide, is known as a Schlager blade right there. So you can use either. To make a single sword, you basically take a practice épée fencing blade and you attach it to a practice saber hilt like this. So yeah, very inexpensive. This is what you'll be checking out. Now, to hold the single sword is a little bit different than a rapier. So there is a little bit of a difference, unfortunately. If you take a look at the single sword right here, you'll see that there's this flat shelf right here on the back of the sword that's in line with the false edge of the blade. Oh, by the way, these are also made right-handed and left-handed. This one is a right-handed weapon, and you can see that this side of the bell guard is a little wider than this side, and that the triangle of the blade is pointing this way. So I'm using that to protect the back of my right hand, and the triangle is pointing towards my outside. If this was a left-handed blade, it would be reversed. This side right here would be wider, and the triangle would be facing the other way. We do have some left-handed swords, so if you are a lefty, I have marked those by putting a little piece of white tape on the handle. So if you need to check something out and you're left-handed, look for the white tape on the handle. Those are our lefty swords. Now, to hold these, you take your thumb and you place it on the flat part of the back of the handle right there, and it's pointing up in line with the edge of the blade. You do not hold it like a broadsword like this with the thumb pointing away. The thumb is always pointing up. So constantly check that thumb if you're using one of these weapons. Make sure the thumb is in line, and when you do that, you're only holding the blade between the thumb and the index finger right here. The other three fingers are just loosely wrapping around, and what they're used for is they're used to snap the sword like this. So it helps us find that real flicking motion and bring the sword to a natural stopping point when doing our fishing line cuts. Okay, so that is how you hold a single sword, just with the thumb right there in line pointing up and down, and the index finger wrapped around the rest of the sword. Okay, so I'm going to be using the actual rapier. Now, this is Rapier and Dagger, not just rapier. We'll be doing single transitional rapier next semester. We also have some parrying daggers. So here's an aluminum parrying dagger right here. Some parrying daggers will have a ring on one side, and if you do, that goes on the outside of the hand. Okay, you can hold this a couple ways. You can hold these like a broadsword, like this, or you can hold these like a single sword with the thumb in line with one of the edges. Okay, some people could also hold it like this, but it's such a small blade you really don't want to, and you don't want to hold it like a handgun either. So my preference is either here or here, and you'll often see me switching back and forth, but I favor this. Now, I forgot to mention, we also have these black polypropylene parrying daggers. So these aluminum parrying daggers right here, these are about $150 a piece. These are like $20-something a piece. So they're going to get torn up. The steel is going to rip them all to shreds, but that is okay because they are cheap and they work just as well as these aluminum ones when we're using the single sword. So when you check out equipment, you're going to check out a steel single sword and a black polypropylene parrying dagger. And the parrying dagger is held with the ring on the outside of the hand, protecting the knuckles and the back of the hand like that. You can hold it with your thumb in line with the false edge, or you can hold it like a broadsword on the side. So that is what you'll be checking out. And I've got my son Dante here, and we're just going to demonstrate some of the motions that you're going to be using in Rapier and Dagger. Okay, so come on out, Dante. Now, first thing that I'd like you to notice, I'm going to come a little bit more over here. First thing I'd like you to notice, back up a little, thanks, is that we are, oh, now he's out of frame. So actually come closer in here, a little closer. Great, here we go. So first thing I'd like you to notice is that right now our feet are mirrored. And Dante, do make sure that you've got a nice wide stance, a little wider. Okay, and hips are pointed towards. Good. So we're mirrored, and this is going to be pretty common in rapier and dagger because you've got something in both hands, and it's less important that our feet line up like puzzles. And a position like this, where I'm on stage left and my right foot is forward, and Dante is stage right and his left foot is forward, means that we're both open to the audience, and the audience is going to be able to see us both very, very well in the fight like this. So this is a pretty common place to be, and it's not uncommon at all to be standing with the opposite foot forward of your sword, which is how Dante is standing right now. Okay, now I also want to mention about our stance. So broadsword and quarterstaff are wider than they are deep. And now this time, single rapier is a little bit deeper. So it is as deep as it is wide. So it's still wide and it's still deep, but our feet are kind of in a square position right now. When we get to single rapier, that will be wider than it is deep. I'm sorry, that'll be deeper than it is wide. Broadsword and quarterstaff are wider than it is deep. Rapier and dagger is as deep as it is wide. So you look down, you should see your feet on opposite corners of a nice big square. Okay, so when we're doing rapier and dagger, we're often going to be attacking with the sword and parrying with the dagger. We want to differentiate this from single rapier and small sword, so we want to use this dagger as much as possible. So this is primarily going to be our attacking weapon. This is primarily going to be our defensive weapon. We're not going to be parrying much with this sword until we get to punto reversos. We will occasionally attack with the dagger. Okay, so we're going to often see this rocking back and forth motion. So Dante weight shifts with me, then weight shifts back and parries, and then he cuts to my shoulder, and here, and here, and here. And so this type of motion is very, very common, where we're rocking back and forth and cutting. And now right now we're just both using fishing line cuts, but we can also use around the body cuts. So I cut here, and Dante does an around the body cut, and I parry as I do an around the body cut, and Dante parries. And so here we're using these around the body cuts that we have in broadsword. And the trick here is just really to figure out what the path of the blade needs to be as we cut here. Sorry, my last cut was a little high. There we go. Boom. There we go. Okay, so it's a matter of really figuring out the path of the blade so that you don't whack your arms together or cut yourself or do anything weird and back yourself into a corner, which is pretty easy to do in rapier and dagger. It's even easier if this was case of rapiers, where we have two swords instead of a sword and a dagger. Thank you so much, Dante. Really appreciate it. Okay, so now let's get into some specifics about attacks and parries. Okay, so now let's take a look at some attacks. Okay, we're going to be doing all the exact same attacks that we did with broadsword, and the only difference now is that the weapon is only in one hand here. So instead of attacking with both hands on the sword, it's just one hand on the sword. But the targets are still exactly the same. We can still do fishing line cuts. We can still do around the body cuts. We can still do front of body cuts, sorry, without a weight shift. Okay, and the targets are still the same. We've got the high line targets, low line targets, we've got the head, and we've got Moline's. Now, the big difference here is that we have this other hand and we want this to be active. It's called active hand. So the idea is that when I am doing something with one hand, my other hand counterbalances it in some way. So as I go around the body, my dagger hand's going to come out front and be threatening. And then it's going to cover a part of the body that's not covered by my hand so that I'm not as open. So I can go here with my palm supinated, or here threatening, and then I can come around. So this is called active hand. And I can do it while I'm attacking, and I can also do it while I am parrying. So parry, 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 parry. And again, I'm doing the exact same parries for broadsword, so I still have parry 3, I still have a direct parry 4, I still have my half counter parries 2, direct parry 7, half counter parry 3, half counter parry 7, and so on and so forth. And I still have Moline's, head cuts, etc., etc. The big difference is that the other hand is active. So here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to do a full sequence of attacks and parries. We're going to go shoulder, shoulder, hip, hip, attacking, and then shoulder, shoulder, hip, hip, defending. And I really want to see your weight shifts and your active hand. So here's the shoulder, shoulder, hip, hip, attacking, and then I'll do parrying. And here we go. Attack, attack, hip, hip. Now parry, and shoulder parry, and hip, and hip. And your dagger does not have to do the exact same thing that mine does. It just needs to be in constant motion and counterbalancing whatever the sword hand is doing. So get creative, have some fun, do whatever you want, but I want to see that other hand active as you're doing it. Best wishes.